They were born into order, not chaos. In Munich at the turn of the 20th century, the Himmler household ran on discipline as strict as any barracks. Joseph Himmler, a respected schoolmaster proud of having tutored Bavarian royalty, believed character was forged through obedience. His wife, Anna Maria, enforced that belief: daily mass every Sunday, prayers before meals, rules without exception. The three sons Gebhard, Heinrich, and Ernst grew up learning a simple lesson: duty mattered more than doubt. Yet buried beneath that respectability was a quiet pressure that would one day fracture history itself. And no one in the household could yet see where it would lead. By the standards of their time, the Himmlers were exemplary. They valued education, structure, and advancement. The boys wore uniforms proudly, excelled in school, and internalized hierarchy as something natural, even comforting. There was nothing outwardly radical about them: no drunken rants, no street violence, no fringe politics. This was precisely what made them dangerous. They learned early that authority deserved loyalty, and loyalty demanded silence. Questions were not forbidden, but they were discouraged. And slowly, almost invisibly, morality was replaced by compliance. The First World War altered the balance between the brothers. Gebhard, the eldest, went to the Western Front in 1917 and returned decorated with the Iron Cross. He had proven himself in the furnace of modern war. Heinrich, by contrast, was too young to fight. He trained obsessively, desperate to join, but the armistice came before he ever reached the battlefield. Germany's defeat did not just end the war, it branded Heinrich with a sense of humiliation that never left him. He had missed the one moment when sacrifice still carried honor, and that absence would haunt every choice he made afterward. When Germany collapsed into revolution and hunger in 1919, both Gebhard and Heinrich sought meaning in violence. They joined the Freikorps under Franz Ritter von Epp, paramilitary units tasked with crushing leftist uprisings in Munich. Street fighting replaced classrooms, ideology replaced ethics. Violence became political purpose. Ernst watched closely. He did not fight, but he absorbed the lesson. Stability came from force, and force came from obedience. And then, in November 1923, the moment arrived that would bind the family's fate to a single movement forever. Heinrich marched with Adolf Hitler during the Beer Hall Putsch, carrying the Imperial War flag through Munich's streets. The coup failed, shots were fired, Hitler was arrested. To outsiders, it looked like a humiliating end. But for Heinrich and for the brothers who stood beside him, it was a beginning. Allegiance had been proven in public. Loyalty had been displayed without hesitation. And once loyalty is given, it rarely asks permission to return. From the very start, morality was never the measure of belonging, loyalty was. That principle, learned at the family table and reinforced in the streets of post-war Munich, became the foundation of everything that followed. If you're finding this story unsettling already, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps this channel bring hidden histories like this to more people who need to hear them. Because what happens next isn't driven by monsters, but by men who believed they were simply doing their duty. And as Germany staggered forward into the 1920s, humiliated, resentful, searching for order, the Himmler brothers were already prepared. They did not ask where the road led, they only asked who was in charge. And soon, that question would have an answer that would consume millions. When the Nazis seized power in January 1933, the streets did not immediately fill with executions. There was no single moment when Germany visibly crossed into genocide. Instead, something quieter happened, something far more dangerous. The Himmler brothers did not rise through violence, they entered institutions. And once inside, they made the system function so smoothly that killing could be done at a distance, without blood on their hands, and without resistance that mattered. Gebhard Himmler's path led through education. A trained pedagogue, polished and respectable, he became a headmaster, then director of a major technical school, and eventually an official within the Reich Ministry of Education. His authority was not theatrical, it was administrative. He decided who qualified to study engineering, who could design bridges, machines, factories. Under Nazi law, that decision was no longer based on ability or merit, but on racial classification. Jewish students were excluded with a signature. Careers ended without explanation, futures vanished quietly. By the time the war approached, Gebhard wore the uniform of an SS Standartenfer, his loyalty now formalized, his role embedded in the machinery of the state. Ernst Himmler took a different route, one shaped by wires rather than classrooms. An engineer by training, he joined the Nazi Party early before power was guaranteed, before allegiance was safe. In Berlin, he found work with the Reich Broadcasting Corporation. Officially, his job was technical. In reality, radio was the regime's most powerful weapon. Ernst helped ensure that Nazi rallies echoed across Germany, that Hitler's voice reached into kitchens and workshops, that ideology felt intimate and inevitable. He played a key role in broadcasting the Nuremberg rallies and the 1936 Olympic Games, presenting the Reich to the world as modern, peaceful, and efficient. Millions listened, millions believed. The brothers understood something crucial. Belief did not require coercion if it was repeated often enough. Radio normalized obedience, schools filtered loyalty. Bureaucracy transformed exclusion into procedure. And at the center of it all stood Heinrich, now Reichsführer SS, overseeing a system that no longer needed to shout. Ernst, rising to SS Sturmbannführer, became an insider, trusted enough to report loyalty and dissent directly to his brother. Family loyalty merged seamlessly with state power. And once that line disappeared, there was no longer a place to stand outside the system. Then came a moment that revealed how completely choice had been absorbed by ideology. A colleague classified as half-Jewish under Nazi racial law approached Ernst for help. The man was valuable, skilled, and loyal. Ernst could have intervened safely. He had connections. He had authority. No one was watching closely enough to punish him for compassion. Instead, he wrote to Heinrich. The letter was brief. The language was chillingly casual. The colleague, Ernst said, was useless. The system did the rest. Deportation followed. No trial, no appeal, no further thought. What made this act so revealing was not its cruelty, but its effortlessness. No order had been issued. No threat had been made. Ernst simply aligned himself with the logic of power. The regime did not force him to act, it rewarded him for doing so voluntarily. And that, more than any shouting crowd or burning book, is how totalitarianism sustains itself. By the late 1930s, the Himmler brothers had become pillars of the Nazi state without ever pulling a trigger. Education, broadcasting, classification, reporting, each role appeared neutral when viewed alone. Together, they formed an ecosystem of belief that made mass murder administratively possible. As Europe drifted toward war, the foundations were already complete. The killing had not yet reached its height, but the conditions that made it inevitable were firmly in place. And when the war finally came, it would not only test soldiers at the front. It would test the loyalty of those who had helped build the system and reveal how far obedience could stretch when the world began to collapse. By the spring of 1945, the world the Himmler brothers had served was disintegrating. Germany was no longer a state, it was a ruin. Allied bombers had reduced cities to ash, refugees flooded the roads. The Red Army closed in from the east, and Hitler issued commands from a bunker to armies that no longer existed. Yet even as the Reich collapsed, the machinery of obedience kept turning. Loyalty did not end when reason did, and that final loyalty would demand a price no one had planned to pay. Ernst and Gebhard Himmler were living together in western Berlin as the city burned. They were not hiding, they were not fleeing. Like many functionaries, they waited, clinging to the habits of order even as the world outside dissolved into chaos. When the Volkssturm was mobilized, calling up old men and teenage boys to stop Soviet tanks, Ernst was summoned. He was not a frontline soldier. He had spent the war behind microphones and control panels, not rifles. None of that mattered anymore. The state he had helped sustain now demanded his body. On May 2, 1945, As Soviet forces fought street by street through Berlin, Ernst Himmler was killed. The circumstances were never fully recorded. His body was never recovered. He vanished into the rubble of the city he had helped mythologize over the airwaves. He died not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as one more expendable component of a system that consumed even its most loyal servants once it had nothing left to offer them. 3 weeks later, Heinrich Himmler was captured near Flensburg, attempting to escape under a false identity. He had overseen the construction of the camps, the bureaucratization of mass murder, the industrial scale of genocide, yet he would never face a courtroom. During a routine medical examination, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule. Death came within minutes. The man most responsible for the Holocaust escaped judgment, leaving behind only documents, victims, and unanswered questions. Gebhard survived. British forces arrested him and began the slow process of a lied investigation. When questioned about his brother Heinrich, Gebhard did not express horror or distance. He described him as kind, upright, true. He denied knowledge, denied responsibility, denied guilt. And the investigators, overwhelmed by millions of similar cases, moved on. There were only so many prisons, only so much time, only so many men who could realistically be punished. And so Gebhard went home. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, if it reminds you that history is built not only by villains but by professionals who return quietly to civilian life, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this channel reach more people who want history told honestly without comforting illusions. Because what followed was not justice, but something far more unsettling. Germany did not emerge from the war into clarity, it emerged into exhaustion. The need to rebuild competed with the need to remember. For men like Gebhard Himmler, that exhaustion became opportunity. Files were incomplete, memories were selective, and the line between survival and accountability blurred until it almost disappeared. As the rubble was cleared and a new Germany took shape, the question was no longer who had built the system, but who could convincingly claim they had merely followed it. And in that gray space, complicity found its safest refuge. In the aftermath of defeat, Germany did not confront its past all at once, it processed it administratively. Gebhard Himmler entered the denazification system and was classified as a Hitler follower. Not a perpetrator, not an ideologue, simply someone who had gone along. Like millions of others, he argued that he had been a professional, not a political actor. That his work in education had been technical. That family loyalty was not ideological commitment. The process accepted this framing. He lost his pension, appealed the decision, and won. The system that had once rewarded obedience now rewarded forgetfulness. In later years, Gebhard reinvented himself as a humanitarian educator. He assisted Afghan students seeking admission to German universities, navigating the very bureaucratic systems he once used to exclude others. To those who met him, he appeared courteous, patient, and helpful. He never spoke publicly about the Third Reich, never expressed regret, never explained his SS rank. Silence became his final act of loyalty to family, to memory, and to a version of history that allowed him to live untroubled until his death in 1982. Within the family, a comforting narrative solidified. Heinrich was the monster, the aberration. Ernst had been apolitical, a technician caught in circumstances beyond his control. Gebhard was merely a teacher. This story hardened over decades, passed down as explanation and absolution. It allowed grandchildren to grow up without asking dangerous questions, and for a long time, it worked. Archives remained closed, documents stayed buried. The past leapt undisturbed until 1997. That was the year archival restrictions eased and a new generation began to look directly at what had been hidden. Among them was Katrin Himmler, Ernst's granddaughter. As she read through files, party records, SS rosters, and correspondence, the family myth began to fracture. There were memberships that could not be explained away, promotions that required loyalty, benefits that came only with ideological alignment. And then she found the letter, the one written by Ernst, the word useless, the request, the outcome. What shattered her was not rage, but recognition. These were not men driven by madness or sadism. They were educated, functional, polite. They loved their families. They made choices that felt reasonable within the systems they served. And that realization was far more disturbing than the idea of monsters. Because monsters are rare, normal people are not. In 2005, Katrin Himmler published her findings, breaking the silence her family had maintained for half a century. She did not write to condemn her grandfather alone. She wrote to expose a pattern: how violence is inherited through loyalty, how institutions sanitize cruelty, how history survives not just through perpetrators, but through those who make themselves indispensable. Her conclusion was stark and deeply unsettling. The greatest danger is not fanaticism, but normalization. This is not only the story of the Himmlers, it is the story of how modern systems of murder depend on teachers, engineers, broadcasters, and administrators, people who never fire a shot, yet ensure that the machine never stops. It is a warning about how easily morality can be outsourced to authority, and how quietly responsibility can disappear into procedure. History does not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it arrives dressed as duty, routine, and silence. And it waits patiently for someone generations later to finally tell the truth.